Hello, my name is Dr. Gerard Toal, and this is a lecture in my course on global conflicts. And this lecture is on the book by Rachel Kleinfeld, A Savage Order, which has been published in 2018. It is a book that has been published as a trade book by Pantheon Books in New York. Now, who is Rachel Kleinfeld? Well, she is a rule of law expert who is employed by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She is someone who has a PhD from Oxford and a BA from Yale University. Grew up in Alaska, is Jewish, and is someone who has worked in the policy community in Washington, D.C. for over a decade. She would be, in Trumpian terms, described as someone who is part of the globalized elite. She is a global governance expert and consultant, and someone who has worked in a series of different countries, as you can gather from the book, and is interested in the question of what one can do, or what states can do, and particularly what Western states and those who are interested in producing a less violent order across the world can do to achieve that policy end. This is a book which has academic foundations, but it is not a book which is rooted in any one discipline. She's drawing from a series of different disciplines, as well as drawing from her own experience and her own research in different countries. Particularly countries that the United States has been heavily involved in, like Georgia and also Colombia. She talks about moving beyond research which has scholars working in different silos. But the policy implications and her interest in policy shows throughout the book. As a trade book, there is not an awful lot of scholarly conceptual discussion, but there is interesting discussion in the footnotes. That's the trade-off that one makes when one writes a book for a broader audience. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the particular arguments that she's seeking to make here. So, first of all, she sets up the book by discussing the fact that overall the rates of violence have declined, and they're at a relative low in human history. So in this sense, she's echoing the arguments of Steven Pinker here. Now, you will know from some of the other research that is out there that this particular thesis, Pinker's thesis, is challenged. And particularly the book by Sinisa Malešević, The Rise of Organized Brutality, which I've used in this course in the past, talks about violence in structural terms, and how, while the actual physical violence rates may be really quite low, we are also in a condition where you have violence normalized and institutionalized, and of course we are potentially on the eve of nuclear war, which could be devastating for humanity in a broader sense. And that is to say nothing of the particular looming catastrophe that is climate change. So in that sense, perhaps Pinker's argument, which generates certain optimism, needs to be framed within a larger discussion of structural violence. And that category of structural violence is one that's really not at the forefront of this book, although it is there conceptually. So she points out that in 2016 there were approximately 23 countries which had about 77% of the world's population, but those countries accounted for 44% of the violent deaths worldwide. So her focus is very much on violent death, and she points out that this is very difficult to calculate, that statistics are imperfect, particularly in authoritarian societies where a lot of things are not recorded, and in that sense they're not part of the statistics. Overall, as a book which is focused on physical violence, she is actually, as I pointed out, she is addressing structural violence without naming it. And what she wants to do, and how this book, I think, was conceptualized initially, was conceptualized within a US geopolitical culture which was preoccupied with the global war on terror. And so she wants to get a few things out of the way at the beginning, particularly the ways in which violence is attributed to religion, Islam, or it's attributed to a particular tactic, or it's attributed to particular socially undesirable groups, others, gangs, criminals, thugs, evildoers. Or even that it's attributed to certain tropes like ancient hatreds or violent culture. She argues we need to dig deeper than that. And if you dig deeper in looking at, for example, international terrorism, you find that that is correlated not with poverty, but correlated with government repression, as she notes on page 33. So the initial point of entry for her is that violence isn't just war. Violence includes a lot of homicides within a state. It includes the state killing people. It includes organized criminal violence, war, and then state killing of civilians and security service killings and the like. So we need to dig deeper, and when you dig deeper, you find that weak, poor governments are one of the things that we have to look at. We have to look at the question of the state, but she wants to ask why is it that in situations where you have weak and poor governments that you get so much violence. And her argument throughout the book is that what we need to study is what she calls privileged violence. And this is a pernicious form of state power. So the book is about how the state is implicated in the production of violence, and how the state is itself an actor that needs to be addressed as a cause of violence, and then also as a potential solution to violence. A particular type of state kills people, and then a particular type of state can help address that and be part of the solution to that. So how does she discuss that? Well, she wants to talk about the difference between weak states versus complicit governments. There is, and through a series of diagrams at the outset of the book, she wants to argue that absolute weakness is not the key to understand violence. It's not that there's an incapacity of the state. In many instances, you have violence with high capacity on the part of the state. That it has, for example, in World Bank government performance evaluations, relatively high scores. Provision of public goods, relatively high. And you still have, in this particular case, high levels of murders of journalists. She also looks at the case of government capacity and violence against minority groups. which is something that we have looked at in this particular course, the so-called ethnic violence or ethnicization of violence. Now, there's a lot going on in this particular diagram, and in one sense, in displaying these, she sort of moves on very quickly from these particular diagrams. But the point that she wants to make, I think, is a very good one. And she wants to ask, and she does ask, page 35, why were countries that were clearly capable in many other realms unable to protect their peaceful minorities? And she points out that in examining violence, we have to say that most violent regimes are associated with democracy. They're not necessarily authoritarian regimes. They're not quite full, mature democracies. They're not autocracies. They tend to be intensely polarized democracies. As we've looked at in this course, they, in many instances, tend to be ethnocracies. So weak democracies with bad governance, with corruption, with selective repression, those are the places that had the highest murder rates among all of the countries on the globe. And it's that sort of the relationship between a state and power structures within that state that is at the center of her particular interest. So here you can see how in mixed regimes they have very, very high violence, and it is the ways in which you have bandits, police, and the mafia working together, and in many instances having a relationship to the authorities in the state, that is what she wants to look at in this particular case. So she outlines at the outset 5 guiding ideas in the book. First of all, violence is a governing strategy. So she wants to look at the ways in which we think about violence not simply as a product of bad actors or others, or of war that we are fighting. Rather, we need to look at it in relationship to the state and to the capturing of the state by certain interests, the instrumentalization of the state, and the ways in which state structures themselves, and also private militias which may have been granted impunity from the state, will use violence as a strategy to protect and entrench a certain structure of power, a particular structural violence, condition of structural violence, which is perpetuated by direct physical violence. So that's the first point. Secondly, she wants to argue, and here she's drawing upon Norbert Elias. And Norbert Elias is a very, very interesting figure. He is someone who was born in what is now Poland, but was then part of the German Empire, was Jewish and fled Nazi Germany, and wrote a series of books about that, drawing upon that sort of cockpit of experience, which were only sort of rediscovered in the late 1960s. But he had particular interest in the civilizational process and the ways in which, I guess, societies learn to become socialized into higher and higher levels of norms, of behavior, and of civilization. Now, the term civilization can be problematic because it can be pejorative and associated with a superiority that's not necessarily warranted in the case of, let's say, imperial rule, and the sense in which certain imperial powers see themselves as civilized relative to barbarians in colonial countries. Ellis's understanding of it is much more sort of detached. There is a normative quality to it. but it is more detached, and he wants to sort of document the particular norms by which societies gradually adopt these behaviors, which lead to the use of less physical violence to resolve disputes and the like. And so what she does is she takes that particular idea and she connects it to other work on social norms and on sort of cascades of positive behavior and feedback loops, the sort of broken windows, conceptualizations concerning the particular environment in which people pick up cues and learn about order. So she wants to take that and apply that. And so she does that throughout the book. That's the second theme. The third theme is a focus on the middle class as a fulcrum of change. And here she's particularly interested in the ways in which a certain structure of a power within a state may leave the middle class vulnerable, or it may not touch them, so that they may be fine with the particular structure of power which has violent elements of it, because it allows the middle class to barricade themselves into gated communities and sort of rationalize the endemic violence within their state by projecting it onto socially undesirable others. That's something that's associated with criminals and associated with the behaviors of the lower class groups, or the behaviors of socially undesirable groups. And it's when the middle class is actually touched by and impacted by that. And she begins with a very horrific story from Honduras that we have the potential for change and in the ways in which it is impacted. And of course we see that in the United States too, in which you have violence bleeding into middle class communities, middle class schools and the like, and then that creating social movements, political movements for change to address the endemic violence within a society. Fourthly, she wants to talk about what type of state is required in order to create a positive trajectory from a condition of savage order to a much more civilized, much more reduced violence condition where you have sort of positive feedback loops occurring. And here she talks about the process of transition. Governments need to do dirty deals. There's a centralization and surveillance. There's a strong state required in order to address the savage order, to get to a less savage order. And then the fifth point is the ways in which you have to sort of keep that positive trajectory on the road, on the track, and that is to do with education and with the institutions in a society which can prevent polarization and prevent the capture of the state by certain groups and the use of violence with impunity by certain actors within the state. So those are the guiding ideas within the book. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the key concepts. Now, one of the key concepts is this idea of privileged violence. And this is her phrase, her term for essentially captured state structures, which are ruling in the name of a particular clique, a particular dynasty, or a particular ethnic group, a particular power structure, usually an economic power structure. And they use violence to protect a condition of structural violence, a condition of inequality, of very, very unequal outcomes in life chances across the society. And privileged violence is violence with impunity. It's not necessarily undertaken by the state, although the state may employ certain create certain special forces in order to perpetuate violence, or to use violence to perpetuate its control. And these, of course, may be anything from special forces, elite forces, to riot police. And a repressive, coercive state apparatus. But it also can involve private militias. It can involve mafia gangs. It can involve traffickers and the like. The key into privileged violence is that the use of violence by these actors has impunity. They're not going to be called to account. In many instances, that action is legitimated by describing it as necessary, as something that is inevitable, it's something that is required, and then in certain instances can be denied by the state because there's no evidence of direct collusion between the private actors involved and the actual agents of the state, the officials of the state. But when you have a potential accountability, when someone is called up for murder or called up for a lynching, for example, then there is a greater chance that they will get off because of the power structure within the society and the ways in which certain excuses are used in order to legitimate that particular violence. Now, the question she's asking is, to what extent is this sustainable? There is a decivilizational process occurring where you have increasing tolerance for normalization of brutality and normalization of killing, target assassination, and the like. And if it's projected as necessary and also kept out of sight, then a society can continue to function with a certain level of this privileged violence occurring because it's legitimated. But does this impact in the middle class? Is there a middle class? Of course, it's a question that's not really pushed fully in her book. So that's an important question, because in certain instances you will have privileged violence and there's not a middle class. There's a really huge gap between those that are the part of the structural violence of the power structure and then the vast majority of the population who are outside of that or are separate from it. And then how does this impact the society, and how does it impact media? Is the media captured? Is there a possibility of creating a degree of accountability through exposure of crimes and of brutality on the part of certain structures or not? So the book is the story of a series of imperfect, heroic reformers, a lot of whom have, as we said, messiah complexes. There's a certain psychological dimension to the leadership, these sort of workaholic, frenetic characters that are featured here. But what I think is quite interesting about the book is that she addresses governance at multiple levels. So she addresses at the state level by looking at Mikhail Saakashvili, who's former president of Georgia, took over after the so-called Rose Revolution, as well as Alvaro Uribe, who became president of Colombia. So that's at the state presidential level. And then Nitish Kumar in Bihar in India at the more sort of sub-state level. And then at the mayoral level, looking at the mayor of Bogota, Tanas Mocus, this particular character here, and Sergio Fajardo, who is the mayor of Medellin. And finally, she's also talking about the story of Giovanni Falcone, who was an anti-mafia prosecutor in Italy, who was murdered in very horrific circumstances. Now, all of these are imperfect figures in lots of ways, and I think one of the things that's valuable about the book is the way she brings this out. Interestingly, she doesn't talk too much about the fact that a series of these figures are Western educated, Western educated, Western educated, Western educated. Or rather, I shouldn't say Western, US educated, coming from the top universities in the United States. And so here's the particular sort of engine of the book. The plot of the book. And you have conditions of privileged violence. You have conditions of a savage order. How does the state go from a condition of privileged violence, savage order, to a condition where you have a significantly reduced physical violence and much better outcomes, in certain instances, quite incredible outcomes in terms of rule of law and development and the like. And so she takes us through this process of the state having to make deals with the perpetrators of this privileged violence, non-state actors in many instances, and then some of the implications of that. The violence may intensify. These deals are inherently unjust. Some instances, they create a condition of false peace, which is simmering and which breaks down, and then you get sort of a feedback loop here and here. So this is a sort of path-dependent argument that she's developing here, and in many instances that path may not get very far and you're back to a certain condition again. But she wants to argue that in certain cases you have dirty deals done, and that creates a critical juncture for the possibility for the state to jump to a new track or to create a new path, which is a virtuous path for it with sort of positive feedback dimensions to it. So there you have the possibility that political movements can emerge. She talks about the jiu-jitsu that is required on the part of these political movements that need to be, on the one hand, political, but on the other hand, bipartisan, and seen as part of sort of good governance and societal, having societal interests rather than sectoral or sectarian interests. She also talks about charismatic leadership and these sort of heroic figures that emerge, but they only can create something if they have a political movement behind them. And then after that, how do they negotiate the process through these eventful processes of seizing windows of opportunity when in dealing with a power structure and trying to roll back its power, you may have the reassertion or an attempted reassertion by that power structure, by these private actors, or even by elements of the state to try to assassinate the president or to stop the civil rights movement or the like. How do you, or in the case of Falcone, to kill Falcone and to kill other mafia prosecutors, how do you seize that window of opportunity? And then that's where there's a sort of an outrage created because of this shocking violence which is perpetrated by the challenge power structure. The structural violence of that savage order is exposed to the society writ large, and then there's the possibility for a political movement to institutionalize the Voting Rights Act in the case of the U.S. civil rights movement, the anti-mafia laws in the case of the effort to try to tame the mafia in Sicily and Naples, and the like. She also points out that centralization and surveillance is crucial to this, and so in this sense, there's a need for a strong state. And that's part of the particular ways in which this can occur. So there's the tools to fight violence. She has a whole chapter on this: intelligence and surveillance, the RICO Racketeering Act, the seizing of assets, the use of informants and witness protection. And what's interesting in that chapter is the diffusion of laws from Sicily to Georgia and elsewhere, and from the United States to Colombia and elsewhere. And then she also points out that countries turn to repression, and it's very difficult for heroic reformers who often have messiah complexes to give up power, to move on. And so she discusses the case of Georgia, which is really quite central to the book, and Georgia's rough justice and the sort of telephone justice that is institutionalized or became institutionalized in the latter years of Saakashvili's rule, where the prosecutors or the judge would wait for the telephone call from the government to say what they were to do in certain instances. In many cases, in the case of Georgia, if you're swept into that particular system, you were going to jail because the conviction rate was like 99%. And so in that sense, this was a coercive state. The state became abusive of the rights of its citizens. And so that is part of the story too. And then she wants to talk about this last part, re-civilizing, and what that means, the societal supports that are required for it. She talks about the shifting of phase space, the mobilizing of the middle class, and lastly, she talks about what is her bailiwick, which is US development and security aid and best practices in that particular domain. So that's the book. That's the kind of set of arguments that are made in the book. Now, let's talk about some weaknesses of the book. I think those that are scholars of violence will find that this is a meso-governance perspective on violence. So it doesn't address the sort of macro and micro foundations of violence. So the micro foundations of violence having to do with small groups and the sort of institutional solidarities that develop amongst certain groups. She's certainly aware of that, and that is something that I think is part of her understanding of how violence can perpetuate itself. But there's not a sort of a systematic engagement with that. The macro level gets at the point number 2 here, the limits of avoiding geopolitics. One of the things that makes this book interesting is the fact that she sort of dismisses the rhetoric of the global war on terror at the outset and seeks to provide an analysis of violence as a social policy problem, as a governance policy problem, rather than as a geopolitical problem, a problem of war and fighting terrorism. And so that in and of itself is a very important and kind of useful gesture within the particular context of the global war on terror. Now, of course, that context has shifted a little bit. When she began that book, I'm sure that the book, I'm sure that was much more central. So 2015, 16. Less so today, where there's much more focus on great power competition, as all of you would know. But there is a geopolitical context to the case studies that she looks at. And the US is heavily involved in providing aid to the Georgian government and also to the Colombian government. Now, she doesn't talk too much about Afghanistan and, of course, Iraq, where this is much more manifestly the case, nor does she talk about Egypt. But that is something that needed to be part of the context here. Certain savage orders are enabled by geopolitical structures. And the US is part of that and has historically been part of that in shoring up right-wing governments across the Americas and elsewhere. It is not possible for the US to support left-wing political movements. So there's a sort of a dimension there, whereas the Russians or the Soviets in the past supported left-wing reformers. So there's globalized connections, geopolitical competition, which shapes the ways in which we need to think about savage order. We need to think about the fact the US is the largest arms exporter in the world, and there was a project here of making the world safer for a US Pax Americana, and that's sort of part of the agenda here. So there's insufficient discussion of that. And I think a number of people who are experts on Colombia would be even more critical than she is of the US's embrace of Uribe and the fact that that meant that the US was essentially supporting policies which were very, very violent in their initial implementation, so Plan Colombia and the like. The Georgia case is a different case. It is one that is still an ongoing one, but certainly things became very, very politicized too within Georgia. And the 2008 war was a particular moment in which you had the Georgian state using violence against a breakaway territory, in part because it felt empowered by its relationship to the United States. Now, third point, conceptual imprecision. Well, the book talks about uses the languages of political scientists. It, in one instance, talks about natural experiments. There was an initial discussion of sort of comparisons at the outset, in which Georgia was supposed to be compared to Tajikistan and the like. That sort of fell by the wayside, and in that sense, it sort of promises more than it actually delivers. And I think that political scientists and other scholars will find that it has a certain conceptual muddiness to it. I think that you could also argue that this decivilization process is conceptually imprecise too. I mentioned the broken windows theory. I think that this can be given a greater precision, but the degree to which that is related to civilization and the degree to which you can see it and not see it is an issue that is subject to considerable debate. You could also argue, and this is point 4, that the particular methodology used by the book and the sort of the genre plotting of it is that it's a sort of heroic story genre where you go from the worst to the best. You go and you have charismatic individuals and reformers and heroes, and that perhaps misses out on the murkiness of a lot of the changes here. Now, I actually think that she does a really excellent job of pointing out throughout the book that this was imperfect. These particular figures were imperfect. Some of the outcomes were far from ideal and were very debatable. But the trade book sort of plot is one that is there in the background, and there's when I was reading the text, you get the sense that that you're looking for there's a certain desire for the hero in this particular story, and to her credit, I think at the end she says, there really aren't heroes so much as certain practices, best practices that we can sort of push towards cultivating. The last point is from privileged violence to softer structural violence. She points out that the strategy that she is dealing with is morally murky. So the whole question of justice is one that is left hanging. It's some of the people that the US has empowered, or some of the people that the particular policies that were pursued has let off, have done horrible things and have been responsible for considerable violence, and that violence has been granted impunity, that they're not held to account for that. And if you are a victim of that violence, the world looks very different to you from someone who is a researcher who's looking at the overall picture and looking to try to point to best practices in terms of security reform and dealing with police and the like. That is sort of a perspective where, what you see is where you sit, and it is one that I think that we need to be attentive to. Because there is an unsatisfactory quality to what is the outcome here. But overall, I think the book is really a very valuable one. It seeks to ask important questions, and it seeks to push towards better practices, greater self-awareness on the part of the United States about its own policies and how they fit into these broader trends. So in that sense, I think it's very, very helpful and useful for us in this course. Okay, let me leave it there. I hope you enjoy the book.